In this presentation, we are going to look more closely at the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. We'll look more closely at what happened with Germany and with the city of Berlin, and what was agreed upon and divided with that country and with that city. And that will be our main focus for today as we continue with the tensions of the Cold War. So part of the agreement that was made towards the end of World War II with the Yalta Conference was that Germany would be divided into 4 different zones. As time went on, 3 of the zones that were controlled by the United States, Britain, and France were actually combined into one country called West Germany. The other zone was to be called East Germany, and that was controlled by the Soviets. So Germany was divided basically into 4 parts, but then consolidated down into 2 different parts. The city of Berlin, which was in the East German side, was also divided into these 4 different parts as well. So over here is Berlin, which is deep in the heart of East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviets. But they decided to make that city separate, where you have pretty much democracy in West Berlin and communism in East Berlin. So as Berlin gets divided, you really have these 2 different parts and these 2 different ideas, and really these 2 major different types of lifestyles. In the western part of Berlin, that's more democratic. That's where you have the Allied nations controlling that part, and people had a good life. They were able to choose what they wanted. While in the east part of Berlin, that was all communist. That was controlled by the Soviets. And so people didn't get to choose really what they wanted to do. And if you're on the East Berlin side and you see that the people in West Berlin are happier, they're thriving, you're going to want to go over to that West Berlin side. And at this time, there's no actual wall that divides the city, but there's the difference of these 2 different ideas present right next to each other. So as more and more East Berlin people start moving to the West, the Russians, or at this time the Soviets, they become concerned that too many people are leaving for the West. So eventually they decide to do something about that. So here we have 2 different maps. On the left we have the map of East and West Germany. So where it's in red there is the Soviet controlled East Germany, and you have 3 different parts to make up West Germany. Eventually they are consolidated into one country known as West Germany, but right after World War II, Germany was divided into 4 parts. On the right, you have showing more how Berlin was divided. Same concept, you have 4 different parts with Berlin, but basically the west part of Berlin is all democratic countries of Britain, France, and the United States. And to the right, with East Berlin, you have the Soviet-controlled part of that city. So as we talk about the division between East and West Berlin, we're actually going to jump ahead for a little bit to 1961. We were talking about in the 1940s, the late 1940s after World War II, but let's jump ahead to 1961 for a moment. So as this tension between the Soviet Union and the United States continues, eventually there's a wall built in Berlin by the Soviets that actually separates West and East Berlin. The Berlin Wall was designed to keep the East Berliners who were fleeing to the West, to keep them into the East. There was no restrictions for those from the West Berlin side to come over to the East Berlin side, but it was designed so that once you got into East Berlin, it was really hard to get out. And if you tried to escape, you for sure wouldn't be in prison, but sometimes you were even shot. So we talked about this Iron Curtain from those Eastern European countries that were taken over by the Soviets after World War II. Well, this wall, the Berlin Wall, became a physical example of an Iron Curtain. So that picture here up in your top right corner is an actual picture of them constructing the Berlin Wall. Again, that was made by the Soviets in the East Berlin side to keep people from East Berlin from going to the west side of Berlin. Here is a photograph of the Berlin Wall a little bit later on, but it shows on the left hand side, so the area over here is East Berlin, and you can see some more fences. Just kind of looks like a very cold place. On the right hand side in West Berlin, people actually, you see pictures drawn on the wall. You see some light posts, sidewalks, a little bit more trees. Looks a little bit more lively. This is in the winter, but looks a little bit more lively than even the East Berlin side. But there's the example of the Berlin Wall, that physical example of the Iron Curtain that the Soviets had on their influence against the West. They wanted to make sure that communism and democracy did not mix. Now let's jump back to 1948 as the first actions against one another between the Soviet Union and the United States actually takes place. So as West Germany and then West Berlin is brought together basically into one piece from the Allied powers of World War II, the Soviets, they get upset about this. So what they do is they decide to put a blockade on the western part of Berlin. So they close all highway and railroad links to the west. So remember, Berlin, let me get my little pencil here, is right there. If you look in the top right, Berlin is completely in the East Germany side. So by cutting off the highways and railroads to Western Berlin, there is no way that there could be any food or supplies getting to the people in West Berlin. So what did the United States do? They responded with something which became known as the Berlin Airlift. They refused to abandon West Berlin. They began a massive airlift to feed and supply the city. And within a year, Joseph Stalin lifted the Soviet blockade. The United States had met another test during this Cold War, and it showed that the United States and the Allies would not retreat when they faced this aggressive behavior by the Soviets. So you have the Berlin blockade, which is by the Soviets to cut off this food supply to West Berlin, and in response, this massive food, fuel, and other supplies came into Berlin by the United States, which became known as the Berlin Airlift. So only a year later, in 1949, the United States creates a treaty called NATO, called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this was in response to those Soviet blockades of Berlin, where the United States and other non-communist nations agreed to create an alliance that if any one of those nations were attacked, that they would attack back, that they would pledge together to defend each other. And in response, the Soviet Union created something called the Warsaw Pact, which was basically the same thing, to where if they were ever attacked or any of its nations, basically those satellite nations that we talked about earlier were attacked, that they would attack back. So think back to World War I, where one of the reasons why we got into World War I was because of these very deep alliance systems, and similar even to World War II. Well, now we're back at that same point, to where if any of these countries that are aligned together with NATO or the Warsaw Pact get attacked, we could be into another world war. And so this is only 4 years after World War II had ended. If you look down at that map, all those countries in red represent NATO, so quite a bit, and then all the countries in purple were part of the Warsaw Pact. So Europe again is a hotbed for destruction, that if one bad thing happens, we could be in another war. And NATO is still something that does exist today, and it is something that is based on that alliance system. So again, one of the reasons why it's called the Cold War is because there was all these threats, but we actually never fought directly against the Soviet Union. And as we refer back to the Truman Doctrine, which said that we would send military aid and economic aid to countries that were being threatened with communism rising up, some things actually happened to where we actually didn't do anything to honor that. What happened was in 1956 in Hungary, there was actually an anti-communist revolution that the Soviets suppressed with violence. We didn't do anything about it. 1961, the Berlin Wall gets built, direct wall to separate the East and West Berlin. We don't do anything about it. In 1968, Czechoslovakia is actually invaded by the Soviets to suppress and overthrow a Czech reform type of government. We don't do anything about it. So there were things that happened that even though we said we're going to make sure communism is under control, the Soviets did some things that we didn't respond to. But there still is this big tension between us, the United States, and the Soviet Union. So to summarize this portion of the Cold War, let's review and go over a few things. Germany and the city of Berlin were divided into different parts. Basically, you can boil it down to two parts. You have the western part of both Germany and Berlin, which is about democracy. The eastern part is about communism. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961 by the Soviets to keep people in East Berlin. The Soviets, back in 1948, in response to the Western Germany and West Berlin being united with democracy, they threaten and do a Berlin blockade, which cuts off supplies and food to West Berlin. In response, the United States comes out with the Berlin Airlift, which is many airplanes that were flown in to provide food to the people in West Berlin. Right after that, in response to the blockade, NATO was formed to create an alliance in case of any attack to any NATO country, and in response to that, the Soviets create the Warsaw Pact, which is an alliance between them and their other satellite nations. And that will take us to this part of the Cold War.